It should be remembered that there was also an armed resistance to British colonial occupation of India. Of course, ultimately this has to also reflect in the school textbooks. So we cannot wish away the Chinese in the short run. There is no doubt that the mainstream narrative of India's freedom struggle is dominated by the story about the non-violent movement. While this did have a role, it should be remembered that there was also an armed resistance to British colonial occupation of India, and that had a big role to play. Now, it's not that we have forgotten all these names like Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, Sachin Sanyal, Raj Bihari Bose and so on. But the fact is, you get the impression from the official narrative that there were some sporadic events in the fringe and that they had no real impact on the mainstream narrative. That is totally not the case. The purpose of the book is to show that the revolutionaries were very much a mainstream movement. They were not only important as a part of a resistance to the British, they were important within the Indian National Congress itself. In fact, you cannot understand the Indian National Congress without reference to what the revolutionaries were doing. In fact, as Netaji demonstrated, the revolutionaries were capable of winning an election within the Congress for the party president against the Gandhians. So, the revolutionary movement has to be given back its correct, true place in our national narrative. So, I think the key thing is that first of all you need greater recognition of many of these great freedom fighters. The book is one contribution to that, but you've also seen recently Netaji's statue being put on Kartavya Marg in the middle of Delhi. As another step, the insides of Victoria Memorial in Kolkata has been converted to a Biplabi Bharat museum, which is dedicated to the revolutionaries and so on. So, in some ways they are being brought back into the conversation. Of course, ultimately this has to also reflect in the school textbooks, which I hope will happen over time. There are dozens of such characters. So I will give you some names, but let me tell you about one of them, just as an example. Many of you may never have heard of somebody called Pandurang Khankoji. Pandurang Khankoji was an extraordinary person. He was born in the late 19th century in Nagpur, and he then became a part of the revolutionary movement, and in order to escape the British intelligence, he went off to Japan. From there he went to North America, where he gained military training and contacts with the Ghadarite revolutionaries of North America. Then when the First World War started, he made his way to Iran, or what was then called Persia, and he created a group of Persian rebels and Indian revolutionaries and was fighting in the First World War backed by the Germans and the Turks against the British. And his opponent, interestingly, was none other than Reginald Dyer. This is how Brigadier Dyer first made his reputation fighting with Pandurang Khankoji on the Balochistan-Persia border. Anyway, the war ended with the British side winning and the Germans losing. So now Pandurang Khankoji was left an orphan. So he first made his way to Russia and then ultimately made his way to Mexico, where he became a very famous agricultural scientist. And many of the technologies we now know as the Green Revolution are actually the source of it is Pandurang Khankoji. And then in the 1950s he came back to India and introduced these technologies in India, leading to the Green Revolution in India as well. Now here is just one character, Pandurang Khankoji, amazing contributions to freedom fighting, great adventurous life. Just his contributions to the Green Revolution and changing the world's food production patterns would alone have made him all-time great. And yet most Indians will probably have never heard of him. the bilateral deficit with the Chinese is growing, but do note that overall what we are doing, we are clearly providing various schemes to wean away investments and insert ourselves into the supply chain. So we cannot wish away the Chinese in the short run. They are a part of the global economy, and they are an important source of all kinds of inputs into things that we want to do. So for the time being, we have to be willing to trade with them, and also, even in the long run, we'll have to accept them as part of the global supply chain. However, at the same time, we are making sure that we are creating capacities for various things in India. For example, India has now emerged as a serious player in manufacturing of Apple phones. We are the second largest producer of Apple phones after China itself, and we will catch up with them in the next 2 years. Samsung has its largest smartphone manufacturing facility in Noida. We are now working with the Taiwanese companies to create fab plants in India. We were already before that a major supplier of pharmaceuticals. We are now finally entering a new field, which is defense and space, where we had a sector, but we were not the export of these, but we are now building capacities to be able to export these things. And of course, our old success story, which is the services exports, is doing very well. In fact, people don't realize we export now as much services as we do merchandise goods, and our services exports are growing robustly even now. So the issue about the old pension scheme was simply that it was unfunded. I have no problem with people giving pensions. Question is it or is it not funded? And the issue here is not a center state issue at all, because this is a real issue, is intergenerational, not intergovernmental. The question is, the problem is, if you do not have a funded pension scheme, then effectively you are setting up a tax for future generations, because after all somebody will have to pay those pensions. So the question is, the issue that we have to tackle is intergenerational equity. If you do not have intergenerational equity, what will happen? Current generations will create liabilities and debts which future generations will have to pay. So we need to be careful that we do not leave behind unfunded liabilities for future generations. It's quite one thing to say that we are going to run up debts and build, say, a bridge which we leave behind as an asset for future generations, and quite another thing to say that we will run up debts to create a pension which the future generation will have to fund. See, I do not want to get into the political debate here, but there is an important principle everybody should be aware of, that the states do not borrow on their own steam. They borrow essentially with the implicit guarantee of the central government. Since the states benefit from the sovereign guarantee of the central government, therefore the central government quite correctly puts limits on this, otherwise every state government will borrow as they wish. So therefore some tight limits have to be retained, otherwise you will end up losing control of the borrowings in the country. There are other countries, by the way, where different arrangements are made. For example, in the US allows defaults by local governments. So for example, the city of Detroit defaulted. Now that is not a possibility in India, because there is an implicit guarantee of the central government. So since the borrowing, if you look at the spreads, irrespective of the quality of the fiscal management of the state, the spreads of the states are almost exactly the same. If they are almost exactly the same, then you see there is no incentive for any state to maintain fiscal control. So it has to be done top down. I don't think this is quite true. The technology sector actually went through a massive boom in the last few years and created hundreds of thousands of jobs. Even if there is some cyclical adjustments, it is not the case that the tech sector is shedding jobs. It is a sector that is clearly growing, Of course, it will go through some cycles from time to time, but on the whole, it is a sector that has generated an enormous number of jobs in the last 2-3 years.